I hope you will find these photos as awe-inspiring as I do, and that they will be a suitable accompaniment for the piece I'm going to play. It's an original piece entitled Sunrise Sonata.
you, Eric. That was fantastic. And the music and the slideshow together. I don't think I realized how much I needed that, but I did need it.
What a great
Right.
way to wake up.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No, every day. I don't know.
Okay. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Massimo Pigliucci is an author, blogger, podcaster, as well as the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. His academic work is in evolutionary biology, the philosophy of science, the nature of pseudoscience, and practical philosophy. His books include How to be a Stoic, using ancient philosophy to live a modern life, and Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk. His new book is The Quest for Character, What the Story of Socrates and Alcibiades teaches us about our search for good leaders. We could sure use that. To find out more by Massimo, you can find out more by Massimo at massimopigliucci.org. Massimo?
Thank you. Very much for the introduction and for having me. This is, I forgot how many times I've been here. But
Someone counted, I think it's 6.
6, nice. Nice, thank you. And let's hope to continue. So I'm going to talk about this book, The Quest for Character. And just so that you know, at the end of the talk, the first 2 people that ask a question that I find interesting or meaningful, that's a big caveat, get a free copy of the book. This is an incentive for you guys at home to come next time in person if you can. All right, let's get started by sharing my screen. There it is. You can all see the slides, yes? Yes. Okay. So the book is about what the Greco-Romans can teach us about leadership and character in everyday life. And the first obvious question, so you're not going to get any points for asking it later, is why the Greco-Romans, right? So let's get that out of the way. You know, why am I talking to you about people that were alive 2 millennia ago as opposed to whatever people are saying about character and leadership today? Although, in fact, by the end of the talk, we'll get to what moderns are also saying about it. But mostly this is about the Greco-Romans. Why? For 3 reasons. First of all, because they, and not just they, but also people belonging to other traditions such as Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, just got something fundamentally right about human happiness. They had an insight into what it means to live a good life, or multiple insights into what it means to live a good life, and that insight has proven, you know, the test of time. It's just there. It's a good idea, and if we have a good idea that it's 2,000 years old, why not keep using it? Just because it's old, that doesn't mean it's not good anymore. The second reason is because not only that those ideas have withstood the test of time in terms of people actually using them in practice, but they also, more or less, with some caveats, do withstand the test of modern science. And that to me is important. As a scientist, I am not interested in something that it's just old and doesn't work. I'm interested in something old that does work. And we do have, we'll get to that near the end of the talk, significant evidence that a lot of the stuff that the Greco-Romans were saying actually does work quantitatively, according to modern psychology and social science. That's different, for instance, if you were interested in science in the Greco-Romans, right? So if you are a physicist or a biologist, I would definitely not advise you to pick up Aristotle, unless you have an interest in the history of science, in which case that's fine. But if you were thinking, okay, I'm going to learn quantum mechanics from Aristotle, you would be sorely mistaken. On the other hand, if you were interested in ethics, and in social justice and things like that, I actually would say not only you should pick up Aristotle, but Aristotle is better than a lot of the stuff that has been written over the last couple of centuries. Okay? And we can have that discussion if you want after the talk. All right, so setting it aside about why is it that when talking about the Greco-Romans. The next challenge is, how am I going to talk about a book in about 20, 25 minutes? It's 300 pages long. So, and I also want you to buy the book. So I'm not going to tell you all about the book because it's kind of difficult. Often authors have this tendency of like, okay, let me give you a summary of everything that is in the book. That's just not feasible. It becomes a boring laundry list. So I decided instead of doing that, I will pick on 5 insights or 5 key ideas that you will find in the book. There's more than 5, but I'm going to pick on those just to give you a taste of what the book is actually about and why it might be interesting for you. So let's start with the first one. Insight number 1, virtue can and should be taught. That's virtue right there. That's a photo that I took at the Library of Chalcis, which is in Ephesus in modern Western Turkey. And that is the personification of virtue in Greek, arete. But what is virtue in the first place? The book is mostly about virtue and character and relationship between virtue and character, but we need first to agree on what virtue is. These days, when you hear the word virtue, first of all, you think of something old-fashioned that only old people and Republicans use, which is too bad, because I think it needs to be brought back as a crucial concept. But also, most of us probably would immediately think about the Christian version of virtue. So things like chastity and purity and things like that. The Greco-Romans were nothing about chastity and purity. It was about something else, specifically about 4 so-called cardinal virtues. Prudence, which is sometimes referred to as practical wisdom, that's the knowledge of what is good and what is not good. The idea is that if you don't have that basic knowledge, the rest is hopeless. If you have no idea of what kinds of things are good, then therefore you should pursue them. And what kind of things are not good, and therefore you shouldn't pursue them, then you're lost. There's nothing that we can do about it. The second cardinal virtue is justice, which is understood as behaving fairly and with respect toward other people, the way in which you want other people to behave toward you. This is not a theory of justice in the modern sense of the term. It doesn't tell you what is just or what is not just. It just tells you that if you're dealing with other people, you should be fair and reciprocal in your interactions with other people. Fortitude or courage is the notion that you're going to try to do the right thing even though it might cost you. That's what it means to be courageous. So it's got nothing to do with going out in battle or punching people on the head or anything like that. It's not necessarily, it can be physical courage if it's for the right reasons, but it's really moral courage that we're talking about. And then temperance, that is the ability to do things in right measure, neither too much nor too little. So that's what I mean by virtue. These are, now notice that these are character traits. Hence the connection, the direct connection with character. So if you're a temperate person, it means that other things being equal, you tend to drink not too much, to eat not too much, to do things in right measure, right? Neither too much nor too little. So it's a character trait, and character traits are just behavioral dispositions. It means that, again, other things being equal, you tend to behave in a certain way. And if you want to improve your character, you need to pay attention to how you behave and move in the direction, nudge yourself basically in the direction that you wanna be. Now, the word virtue comes from the Latin virtus, which itself, however, is a translation of the Greek arete, and arete just means excellence. And anything that has a function can have arete, can be excellent at that function. For instance, that ominously looking knife over there. A few days ago, my wife and I went out and got ourselves a new bread knife. And we got ourselves an arete knife, a virtuous knife. What does that mean? It's a knife that cuts the bread very nicely, very easily, very sharply, etc., etc. If it's a blunt instrument, if it doesn't cut the bread very nice, then it's not an arete knife. It doesn't have virtue. Now that's simple to understand in the case of knives because we know what the function of a knife is, but what is the function of a human being? Because the idea that the Greco-Romans had was that human beings have functions themselves. And so you are excellent, you are arete, if you are performing those functions well, and you're not if you're not performing those functions well. In order to answer that question, we need to get a little bit more again into the sort of the etymology of these crucial words. The word ethics comes from the Greek ethos, which means really something to do with character and living together. Okay? So ethics is about solving the problem of how you live in a society with other people through your own behavior, which connects, therefore, the society with the character. Right? Now, morality, it's simply the way in which Cicero translated ethics into Latin. He used the Latin moralis, and it has the same meaning. So I will use ethics and morality as synonyms at this point, interchangeably. And they both refer to learning to live well, cooperatively, pro-socially with other people. It follows, therefore, that the function, for the Greco-Romans, the function of a human being is to live pro-socially, because that's the kind of species we are. There's a second function which I haven't mentioned, and that is to think correctly. Why? Because the large brains are our evolutionary weapon. This is how we make our living. We don't have big muscles, we don't have fangs, we don't fly, we don't swim. What do? When we have a problem, we use our brains to solve that problem. So in fact, human beings, according to the Greco-Romans, have two functions: to live socially and to use their brain to solve problems. So if you want to ask yourself, well, am I an excellent person? Am I an arete person in the human sense? Ask yourself, do I think straight, and am I cooperative to other people? If the answer is yes to both, then you're like the bread knife. You're good to go. Now, the next question, which is related to all of this that I just said, is, well, yeah, but can we teach virtue? Is this kind of stuff the kind of stuff that you can teach people? Right? And Socrates had famously, it was a different, two minds about this. On the one hand, he said, sometimes he says in some of the Platonic dialogues, he says, no, I don't think so, because if it were possible to teach virtue, since it's such an important thing, you would see a lot of teachers of virtue out there. I don't see anybody doing that, therefore it must be that it cannot be taught. But in a crucial Platonic dialogue where Socrates talks to a sophist named Protagoras, the two in the end of the dialogue agree that yes, virtue can in fact be taught. How? Protagoras makes the analogy between virtue and playing a musical instrument, let's say a flute. And he says, look, learning virtue and therefore teaching virtue is the same, it's very similar, it's the same kind of thing. It's a technique, it's what the Greek called a techne, which we translate as technique. It's a skill. And so you learn it just like you learn every other skill. Now, how do you learn how to play the flute, for instance? Well, you need a little bit of theory, because you want to know musical notation, you want to know how the notes are related to each other. Otherwise, you're just doing random noises on the instrument. Ideally, you want a good teacher who is going to look at your form, is going to correct your mistakes, things like that. But mostly, it's about practice, 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 practice. That's really what is going to do it. And Protagoras says, and Socrates agrees, that that's pretty much the same way in which you teach and therefore learn virtue. You want a little bit of theory. I just gave you, for instance, the 4 cardinal virtues. That counts as theory. Their definitions, how they're related to each other, etc. You need a Socrates or a Plato or whoever you can find that has a similar ability to help you out, and then you need to practice. And we'll get to the practice at the end. What does it mean? The only thing that might not be clear at this point is, yes, I know how to practice flute. I'm not sure how to practice virtue. We'll get to that at the end, by the end. So the answer to the first question is, yes, it can be taught, and we'll see later how. The second insight from the book is, if you're not virtuous, don't get into politics. Which means that 95% of politicians should be out of job. Notice that I didn't say 100%, but 95%. And this is where the story that gives the subtitle to the book comes in. So this is a story of the complex relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades. Alcibiades was a friend of Socrates, younger by about 20 years. He was a student of Socrates. He was rumored to be one of Socrates' lovers as well, although there is doubt about that. So there was a complex relationship going on. And Alcibiades, I am stunned that nobody has actually made a movie that I know of yet on Alcibiades' life. If anybody's interested in writing a script, let me know, because we can work on it. This guy was incredible. I mean, he was impossibly handsome, uber rich, dashing, brave. He had anything. It was a very nice, coming out of one of the most important and ancient families in Athens. This guy had everything that you would think is necessary to do what he wanted to do, which was to lead Athens in the middle of the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. So he goes to Socrates and say, here, this is what I want to do. I want to be a leader. I want to be a statesman. I want to be a general. What do you think? And Socrates sits him down and basically does the equivalent of what we would today call a job interview. And it's not going to go well. It's pretty clear that Alcibiades has all of those things. By the way, that's Alcibiades on the left, and that's Socrates on the right. That angel next to Socrates is a Renaissance, well, later Renaissance actually, early modern period rendition of the Socrates' famous daimon. Socrates said that he always had a daimon, which is the same word from which demon comes, right? But it was a positive daimon, it was a good one, on his shoulder, and the daimon would tell him what to do and what not to do. It would basically advise him on what to do and what not to do. Think of him, of the daimon as your conscience, essentially. Externalized, as if you had your conscience on your shoulders talking to you. So Alcibiades has everything except the only thing that really matters, a good character. He's a narcissist. He's clearly into self-aggrandizing. He doesn't really care about making life better for the people of Athens. He just wants glory. He just wants to be famous, and so on and so forth. And so very clearly, very soon, Socrates points that out to him and says, that's not good. Now, as I said, the setting here is 430 BCE for this dialogue. Socrates is about 40 years old. Alcibiades 20 years younger. And we are right at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Okay? So there is the interview, and there is the problem. And the interview ends with Socrates saying, "Then, alas, Alcibiades, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the most extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you are leaping into the affairs of the city before you have been educated." Ouch. Right? This is your mentor that tells you, and friend, and possibly lover, who tells you that. Now, the word translated as stupidity there, it's the Greek word is amatia, which is often also translated as unwisdom, or lack of wisdom. So basically, Socrates is telling Alcibiades, you got a lot of stuff going on for you, except the only one that matters, wisdom. And because you don't have it, you, Socrates says, just a little bit after this quote, you and most politicians, he adds, with few exceptions. And that's why you guys go out and make such a mess of things, right? Now, of course, Alcibiades does not listen to Socrates. He goes into politics anyway. He does get elected general. And I could talk for the next hour about what happens to Alcibiades because, as I said, his life is incredibly complicated and interesting, but it does end 20 years later with his death at the hand of some Spartan spies that were sent after him. They surrounded his house in the mountains. Alcibiades comes out wielding his shield and his sword and crying his battle cry, and people are so afraid of him that nobody wants to engage him in direct combat. So they shoot arrows at him, and that's how he ends up 20 years later. Not a good ending. Socrates was right. He should not have gotten into that kind of business. Now, one could only hope, I guess, that a politician who gets in that business for the wrong reason ends up like Alcibiades, but that would be a little violent, I guess. Insight number 3. A good character is an inside job. Now, we're talking about, the book is mostly, as I said, about not only the relationship between character and politics, but character in general and how to improve your own character. And it turns out it's mostly up to you. That is, you have to be the one that wants to do the job. In the book, I take a close look at a number of case studies from Greco-Roman history to see how they unfold in terms of character development. And they really broadly fall into two categories. There's one chapter where I look at statesmen or politicians being taught by a philosopher, where the philosopher is trying to make them better human beings. And in the second chapter, in the following chapter, I look at cases where the statesman or politician or general himself, they're usually men, himself tries to actively to study philosophy in order to be a good person, a better person, right? So one is, I'm trying to influence you from the outside. The other one is, I am going to do it from the inside. And you'll see the pattern, the result very clearly in the next couple of minutes. Some of these stories, I can't tell you, unfortunately, we don't have time here to get into the details of all these stories, but some of these stories are incredible. For instance, Plato tries twice to teach virtue and good governance to two different leaders in Syracuse, in Sicily, Dionysius the first and Dionysius the second one. And both times he narrowly escapes with his life. In the first case, Dionysius the first sells Plato in slavery, and Plato is rescued by his friends who pay for a ransom. And in the second case, Dionysius II puts Plato basically at house arrest for several years until he manages to escape. So it didn't go very well, needless to say, with neither one of the two Dionysiuses. Kudos to Plato, however, to try. When he did that, he was in his 60s the first time, and in his 70s the second time. So this is 2,400 years ago, when to go from Athens to Syracuse by boat was a perilous journey. And this guy in his 60s and 70s says, this is my chance to try to influence things and put into practice what I've been teaching. I'm going to do it. He failed, but kudos to Plato. That one down there is Seneca trying unsuccessfully to teach the young Emperor Nero. So it turns out that a lot of these cases where philosophers tried to influence statesmen, it failed. It just didn't go very well. They all should have known what Socrates did know, which was just tell him not to do it. That's it. Tell him not to get into that business. Don't try something that it can't be done. One case that went a little bit better was Aristotle teaching Alexander, later known as the Great. One of the reasons I think it went a little better is because Aristotle got to Alexander when Alexander was young. He was 16 or 17, so he was still open to being influenced. Not only that, but in fact, Alexander is it's a bit between the two categories that I'm talking about, because he himself was open to being taught by Aristotle. And in fact, in some respects, I go in the details in the book about this, in some respects, Alexander took Aristotle's ideas and then run with them and made them even more grand, on a grand scale. He tried to apply them on a grand scale. One of the fundamental ideas that Aristotle tried to convey to Alexander was the notion of pan-Hellenism, that is, of unifying Greece as a power on its own right, so that it could withstand other powers of the time, such as Persia. Alexander said, why stop at pan-Hellenism? Why not cosmopolitanism? Why not put together, get together the entire planet, the entire world into one, and open up the world to Hellenistic culture? So in some respects, actually, Alexander went even beyond what Aristotle said. The success stories are all in the chapter that has to do with politicians themselves being philosophers, not being taught by a philosopher, but learning philosophy. Now, well, I'll tell you in a minute what I mean by philosophy here, but it's a philosophy as a way of life, not just as an academic pursuit. So there's a number of cases. Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was a Roman politician and statesman, and the public advocate near the end of the Republic. Cato the Younger, who was a Stoic senator in the same period, about the same time. Dion of Syracuse was actually Plato's third attempt to influence things in Syracuse, and this time he succeeded. And he succeeded because Dion did become the leader in Syracuse, and Syracuse was thriving for several years under Dion's leadership, until, of course, he got killed by somebody who was envious of it. But Dion, it worked with Dion because Dion actually went to Plato and said, teach me. when he was young. So he was a student of Plato from early on, and that was one of the reasons, I think, for the success. And then Marcus Aurelius, one of the famous 5 good Roman emperors who handled very well a number of crises in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century, including 2 border wars and 1 major pandemic, essentially. The largest plague that hit the ancient world, the Antonine Plague, which killed about 3 million people. But Marcus handled it pretty well, considering. And then finally, Julian, known as the apostate, that's the Christian slander for it, because he was the last Roman pagan emperor. He tried to stem the rise of Christianity. All of these people did their best. They didn't necessarily succeed. Cato and Cicero tried to save the Roman Republic, and they failed. But they succeeded in the sense of they were people who were trying to do things on the basis of their principles, and they didn't compromise their principles. They tried to do the right thing. Whether you succeed or not, that's a whole different thing. No amount of virtue will guarantee the outcome, obviously. Virtue only guarantees that you're going to try to do the right thing, not that you're actually going to succeed in doing it. Insight number 4. We should all be philosophers. But philosophers like the guy on, let's see, your left, not the guy on your right. I don't know how many people have seen The Good Place, which is a really nice, funny sitcom with a lot of philosophical content. In fact, one of the major characters, Chidi here, is a philosopher. And you'll see that he represents all the way in which a philosopher should not be, a practical philosopher should not be, because he's very theoretical. He's very into dissecting every single aspect of every single problem, and so he never gets to act on something. He's always indecisive, right? If you want to have a taste of how this works, go on YouTube and look for the Good Place trolley dilemma. You'll see a segment of about 5 minutes where Chidi is put into a real-life trolley dilemma situation. This is one of those things where you're driving a trolley and you're about to hit 5 people, but you have the power to divert the trolley and hit somebody else, one person. What would you do? That's the dilemma, right? And Chidi finds himself into this real trolley, and of course he can't make up his mind, and it just makes a mess out of it. And it's really funny. It's the best explanation of trolley dilemmas I've ever seen. So that's not the way you want to be a philosopher in terms of what we're talking about. You want to be a philosopher as the guy on the left, who is Socrates. That is a practical philosopher, somebody who uses philosophy as a guidance to life, like you do here at Ethical Culture. Yes, it's deed before creed, but if you don't have creed, in other words, if you don't have any kind of idea of what you're going to do, your deeds are going to be random. You don't want random deeds. You want some idea, you want some kind of compass in your mind of what is a good thing to do and what is not a good thing to do. And then, yes, it's mostly about doing it. That's exactly how Socrates, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epicurus, all of these people were practicing philosophy in that sense. They had a moral compass in their mind, and then they were mostly about applying that moral compass to day-to-day life. So that's what the moral compass looks like, right? So a philosopher in the non-academic sense does at least the following. Uses something, if you're in the Greco-Roman tradition, uses the cardinal virtues as a moral compass. So every time you act on something, you ask yourself, well, is this practically wise? It's an awful way to say it, but practical wisdom is the name of the virtue. So practically wise, courageous, just, and temperate. And if the answer is yes, then you do it. If the answer is no, then you don't do it. You strive for ethical self-improvement through a practice of something that often are referred to as spiritual exercises, and I'll give you an example or two in a minute of what that means. And then you're mindful applying what Epicurus called the fundamental rule of life. The fundamental rule of life is the fact that you want to remember that any time that you're facing a situation, there are some things about that situation that are up to you, where your agency is effective, and there are other things that are not up to you. Your agency is not effective. You cannot do anything about it. And so every time you make this distinction, what you're going to do is you're going to focus on what is up to you, because your agency is effective there, and you develop an attitude of equanimity and acceptance toward the stuff that is not up to you. You might have heard this idea in the form of the serenity prayer, where you ask God to tell you, to guide you to understand the difference between what you cannot do, what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the wisdom to accept, the serenity to accept what you cannot. Right? It's the same idea, except that it predates the Christians. And it's found, in fact, not only in the Greco-Roman tradition, but also in Eastern traditions such as Buddhism. Insight number 5, this is the last one. What works and doesn't work when it comes to improving your character. So now we're getting to finally to the practical part. Yeah, okay, all of that is fine. I need to become a better person. I need to practice it. How the hell do I do that sort of stuff? Well, I'll tell you. First of all, let's start with what does not work. And here I'm actually drawing not just on the Greco-Romans, but also on modern science. Because as it turns out, psychologists and social scientists are very interested in the notion of character and character development. So we actually have quite a bit of interesting information based on empirical data about this. So there are three things, in fact, particularly that don't work. One is, not surprisingly, doing nothing. But you hear this all the time. It's like, oh, you get wiser as you get older. No, you don't. You get crankier when you get older. Wisdom is not something that comes automatically from getting older. It comes because you are paying attention to what happens to you as you become older. In other words, it's a mindful aging, not just aging, that makes the difference, right? Wisdom comes from the ability to reflect critically on your experiences. It is true that you require age. To think of a 15-year-old wise person is like, it's almost an oxymoron. Why? Not because the person in question is stupid or whatever. It's just that they don't have enough life experience. But having life experience is not enough by itself. You have to actually be mindfully critical about learning from that experience. Another thing that doesn't look is virtue labeling. We've been told for years to talk to our kids, for instance, and tell them that they're brilliant, they're great, you're so good. No, don't do that, because it actually undermines, in the long term, it actually undermines character development. It creates an illusion of character development, which is not matched by the substance, and so you're actually setting up people for failure. So that is one thing that does not work. Another thing, this is my favorite, that doesn't work is nudging. Nudging is used by a lot of companies these days, and it works in one respect, but not in the one that we're interested in here. If you're a man, you might have seen nudging at work in airports and other public facilities if you go to the toilet. You go to a urinal. I know, the women usually say, what the hell is he talking about? You go to a urinal and you'll see a little fly, the image of a little fly right in the center, smack in the center of the urinal. Why? Because they want you to pee there, not on the floor. And yes, men are that sloppy. If they don't make this into a game, this is gamification, right? Oh, I need to hit the target. Then they don't care, and of course, whoever has to clean the toilets is not going to be very happy. Now, nudging does work. This is called libertarian paternalism, which I think it's an oxymoron, but it does work in the sense that it manipulates people's behavior. Other examples are, these days often companies will put you automatically on a program that saves money for your retirement, or you automatically enroll in the organ donation, for instance, or something like that, right? What's the idea? The idea is that people are lazy, and if I have to actually file the paperwork not to be on the retirement or on the organ donation, I'm not going to do it. And that's how it works. It works in the sense that it does manipulate people's behavior, but it doesn't do it by changing your character, by making you think, oh, this is the right thing to do. It works because you're lazy. And therefore, it's not a good approach when we're talking about improving your character. What does work? 3 things. Well, these are 3 of the major things that work. Adopting a role model. Whether that role model is a person you know or don't know, somebody who is dead or alive, somebody even fictional. One of my role models is Spider-Man. It doesn't matter. There is research that shows that if you act in life by asking yourself first, what would my grandmother do about this? if you go in the South, you'd see a lot of people with a bracelet that has WWJD. What would Jesus do? Right? That's the same idea. Now, I would say what Epictetus does, or what would Epictetus do, or what would Socrates do, but it's the same basic idea, right? Adopting role models does work. It turns out people really do improve their ethical behavior if they mindfully go back to their role model. And this, of course, might be no surprise. This was a common practice in ancient Greece and Rome. Here's Seneca, for instance, who says, choose therefore a Cato, or if Cato seems too severe a model, choose some Lilius, a gentle spirit. He's talking about potential different role models. Choose a master whose life, conversation, and soul-expressing face have satisfied you. Picture him always to yourself as your protector or your pattern. 4, we must indeed have someone according to whom we may regulate our characters. You can never straighten that which is crooked unless you use a ruler. I love this notion of having a ruler, that's your role model, and you're over here and you're crooked, but you don't realize that you're crooked until you actually compare yourself to somebody who is not. And then the notion is you're going to try to change your behavior so that you get closer and closer to the ruler. The second thing that works is to seek situations that are uncomfortable on purpose, to test your character and to improve it. So, you're shy, for instance, volunteer for some public speaking, right? You don't think you are sufficiently generous, get into the habit of putting some pocket change in your pockets before you leave the house, and then give it to the first homeless person you see by looking them straight into the eyes, no questions asked. That's uncomfortable. But if you get into the habit of doing it, the idea is that Aristotle would say, virtue is mostly about habit forming. Initially, you have to do it in a mindful fashion. You have to make a decision to do it, but then after a while, it becomes second nature. It's like learning to drive a car. Initially, you have to pay a lot of attention to the steering wheel and the brakes and the shifting of the gears and all that sort of stuff. But after a while, it becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it. You just do it. Again, this is found in the Greco-Romans. Here is Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher of the early 2nd century. Provoked by the sight of a handsome man or a beautiful woman, you will discover within you the contrary power of self-restraint. Faced with pain, you will discover the power of endurance. If you're insulted, you will discover patience. In time, you will grow to be confident that there is not a single impression that you will not have the moral means to tolerate. I have a colleague, for instance, who practices Stoic philosophy and focuses on that bit there, the insult. He calls himself an insult collector. He actually exposes himself to situations where he's more likely to be insulted than not. And the reason for that is because he wants to test himself. Years ago, he was the kind of person who would get really upset about being insulted. And we would take it really personally. And then at some point said, you know what, that doesn't make any sense. An insult works only if I allow it to work. Otherwise, it's just somebody opens his mouth and puts air out. That's it, right? If I don't react, if I don't allow that person to hit the target, then the insult falls completely flat. So that's one thing that you can practice. And then the last one is paying attention. Surprise, surprise. Actually paying attention to things, mindfulness, as I said before. It's an overused word these days. It's very popular. But mindfulness, really, the Greek word for that Epictetus uses is prosoke, which actually means paying attention. And there is a wonderful bit in Seneca where he asks his friend Lucilius, like, has anything ever improved by not paying attention to it? If you're the pilot of a ship, what do you think is going to happen once you start not paying attention to where you're going? It's not going to get any better. You might not get into a disaster if you're lucky, but you're not going to get better. So here again is Epictetus. He actually suggests a specific technique on how to actually pay attention. Admit not sleep into your tender eyelids till you have reckoned up each deed of the day. How have I erred? What done and not or left undone? So start and so review your acts, and then for vile deeds chide yourself, for good be glad. This is an example of what I was referring to earlier as spiritual exercises. This is called philosophical journaling. If you want an example of that, the entire Meditations by Marcus Aurelius is an example of philosophical journaling. Modern cognitive behavioral therapists would suggest that you do something like this. They wouldn't call it philosophical journaling, but it's the same basic idea. And the notion, what is important here is that how you do it. This is not a diary. You don't write there, today I had a great meal. Who cares? That's not what you're concerned with, number one. Also, you don't use the first person, and you don't use emotional language. Because the idea is to try to distance yourself from your experiences and analyze them so that you can learn from them. If you look at the meditations, it's written in the second person. He says, he writes to himself as if he were writing to a friend. It's like, you did this today, and you could have done this today, right? Which is kind of weird. It's a little, but modern psychologists tell, yeah, that's the way you want to do it. And you want to use analytical, non-emotional language, because the idea is not to relive your experiences. The idea is to understand and learn from your experiences. Hence the questions that Epictetus says we should ask ourselves. What did I do wrong? What did I do right? How could I do better, essentially? Right? So you do that pretty much every day, 5 minutes a day before going to bed, and things are going to get better. And that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Turn off your sharing, please.
Yes, sure, sorry.
I'm really trying to compete with you.
Oh, we have our hands up. First, I want to say thank you for that excellent
Absolutely.
talk. Now that we've heard that practical philosophy and wisdom talk, maybe our deeds will be positively influenced. Okay, honestly, I saw Bob first.
Yes.
No, because you noticed I was taking extensive notes.
I noticed, absolutely.
So here's
now we'll see how good those notes are.
You gave the example.
So he wants a free book.
Exactly.
You know me too well. Oh. So
The camera can see.
Right, yes.
why would the camera want to see me?
I ask myself all the time. But
Yeah. No, you're better looking. So you gave the example of a loaf of bread. You said it has
Yes.
virtue, excellence, and that's easy. It's absolute. You cut it, and if it cuts easily, you're happy with the knife. But is there an absolute of virtue in human beings? Because people subjectively don't view it the same, and you use the word libertarian. I have a friend whom you hate, Don Houtman, and he is a libertarian, and we get into arguments all the time. We say, as humanists, we're virtuous. He says you're not. You're greedy, you're robbing people. How do you resolve that?
yeah. No, that's an excellent question, which means you do get a copy of the book. There you are. And you can keep the mic.
Hopefully he'll get one.
Now, careful there. You want to be virtuous about this, right?
That wasn't the nicest.
All right, good question. So there are a couple of ways to answer that question. First of all, just because somebody disagrees, it doesn't mean that anything goes, right? Too often in contemporary discourse, we take evidence of disagreement as evidence that there is no truth of the matter. Oh, you say this, I say that, therefore, everything goes. Well, no. Think about a different situation. I spent 9 years of my life in Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, as an evolutionary biologist. Half of the population there doesn't believe in evolution. They're wrong. They're just wrong. End of story. There is no, oh well, I think you think so, I think so. So we could agree to disagree. No, you're simply wrong. If you reject evolution, you're just wrong. And the fact that you don't agree or don't understand why, that's your problem, not mine. So just because there is disagreement, tell your libertarian friend, it doesn't matter that the two positions are on this. It doesn't mean that two positions are on the same level. It could be that either one of you is wrong. Now that's the next question is, well, how do we determine who is wrong? Your libertarian friend is obviously wrong. But so that's where a theory of human nature, which is fundamental to Greco-Roman philosophy, comes into play. What makes the knife arete, virtuous, is that it carries out its function nicely, efficiently, and we know what the function of a knife is. That's where they bring in the notion of human nature. They suggest that human nature is fundamentally about two things: being prosocial and solving and using your brain to solve problems. Why do they say that? Because they compare human beings to every other animal that they were aware of, and they said, look, our societies are far more complicated than anything else that is on planet Earth, and our brains are far more complicated and more efficient at solving problems than anything else. That doesn't mean there are no other social animals. Of course there are. It doesn't mean that there are no other animals that are not smart. Of course there are. But human beings do those two things in a way that easily surpasses everything else on planet Earth. And therefore, the Greco-Romans concluded that is what distinguishes human beings from the rest of the animal world, just in the same way in which cutting bread distinguishes a bread knife from a pear knife or from a pair of scissors or from something else, right? So that is the function. It's what's unique to human beings. Now, of course, you could say, no, I don't believe that. And then we're going to have a discussion about human nature. But the fact is, modern primatologists tend to agree with that view of humanity. They tend to say, well, look, if you actually compare, if you look at the evolution of Homo sapiens, and you compare it with our closest relatives, it turns out to be true. It turns out that, in fact, what distinguishes us is our incredible high level of sociality and a high level of intelligence. We are similar to other social primates because we come from a common ancestor. So it's no surprise that we share that with gorillas, with bonobo chimpanzees, with capuchin monkeys and things like that. But it's certainly the case that we are so much better at doing those things that if you think, okay, what is it that distinguishes a human being from other animal species? Those are two very good candidates. The only caveat to what I just said, and that's where your libertarian friend might be rescued from his lack of wisdom.
I don't want to help him.
But I feel charitable. So if you want to, I have a libertarian friend as well, and it's got the same problem. So where we might rescue that sort of position is like, okay, but even if we agree that the proper function of a human being in the Greco-Roman sense is to think through your problems and to be pro-social, there is more than one way to do both. Right? There's more than one way to use your brain to solve a particular problem, and there is more than one way to be pro-social. So your libertarian friend probably thinks that he is being pro-social, he's being helping society. And in fact, Epictetus says, look, people will disagree with you on the specifics, but start your discussion at the top on the general proposition that you want to be a good person and you want to be helpful to others. And then we'll start, if we agree on that one, on that level, then we can sort out the differences from that starting point. So it doesn't mean, so this view doesn't mean that your libertarian friend is necessarily wrong. I think he is, but not necessarily wrong. There is room for more than one way of looking at how to solve the fundamental problem of ethics, which is to live together well with other human beings.
Okay.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Okay, Jim.
Sure,
You were going to pick him. Yes, come over
Okay.
here.
Hi. Thank you. What
Yeah.
a wonderful illustrative talk. You said right at the beginning, if you don't know good from evil or right from wrong, you're hopeless. You're lost. There's no hope.
Right.
Was that rhetorical, or is there a glimmer of hope? And I would think that perhaps through a concept of constructive selfishness, perhaps educating people on the ability to see what the consequences of the direction that they're taking have, that they might share in a clearly defined benefit, that might possibly bring some hope.
Yeah. It's definitely not rhetorical. Here, your book.
Oh, thank you.
No, it definitely was not meant to be just rhetorical. The notion is that if you don't have an understanding, at least a general understanding of the difference between what is good and what is not good, then it's hopeless. So you need to start there. You need to start working on that one. Now, one of the things I find good, interesting, and reasonable about the Greco-Romans is that they didn't think that there was absolute good or evil. For instance, if you think of Kant, one of the modern philosophers, arguably the most famous and influential modern moral philosopher. Kant thinks that there is a universal notion of good and evil, that morality works like mathematics. Even if there were no human beings, it would still be true that something is good and something is evil, just in the same way in which the Pythagorean theorem would be still true, even though there were nobody there to understand it. I'm not sure that I actually buy that even for as far as mathematics is concerned, but I certainly don't buy it for ethics. And the reason I don't buy it for ethics is because ethics is defined in the ancient sense, as I said before, as the problem of how to live with other human beings, which means that whatever truths, ethical truths, you might discover or propose, those are only relative to humanity. If we were not the kind of animal, social, intelligent, etc., that we actually are, we might have a completely different set of ethics, or we might not have any ethics at all. If Martians are individualistic, not social animals, the word ethics wouldn't mean anything to them, because ethics does mean work together for something. If you're not a social animal, there is no ethics to think about at all. So it's relative to human beings. However, they also did believe that there are some things that are universal as far as human beings are concerned. And there, again, they're backed up by modern science. So modern comparative sociology, for instance, shows that there are a certain number of ethical precepts that are essentially universal among human populations. No human society existed or can exist if murder is allowed. Murder defined as the killing, the arbitrary killing of other human beings for pleasure or profit. It just cannot happen. If you allow that in a society, you're just not going to have a society. No human society condones thievery. You cannot have people going out and grab stuff from other people, because again, otherwise you have a collapse of society. There's a number of those things. For a lot of things that we consider ethical, on the other hand, doesn't matter. Whether you eat pork on Sunday or not, who cares? That's not a universal rule. It has to do with your dietary preferences, or maybe where you live. If you live in the desert, I wouldn't eat pork, for instance, especially before the invention of refrigeration, right? That sort of stuff. So there might be practical reasons or entirely arbitrary reasons for why we do certain things. So some of what we think falls under ethics is actually closer to etiquette, right? It's like, it's arbitrary. It's like, do you want to have your fork on the right or on the left? There is no reason one way or the other, but if you live in a certain society where it is proper to have the right, the fork on the right and the knife on the left, that's what you need to do because you live there. So the notion is that some ethical precepts are in fact arbitrary, and therefore we should not care about them. Don't get into an argument you wouldn't get into an argument with somebody who says, yeah, fork goes over here. No, it goes over there. I'm going to kill you because, obviously the fork goes over there. That's nonsense. But the stuff that we should really be caring about is the stuff that it's actually universal. It's the kind of stuff that if we did not do it, it really would get in the way of a flourishing human society. Right? That's the part of ethics that we need to care about. And there, the Greco-Romans thought that's pretty much universal. It doesn't matter. At some point, Socrates says it doesn't matter whether you are in Athens or Sparta or Corinth. You still want pretty much the same things. You have the same fears, the same hopes, the same cravings, and so on, because you're a human being. So cosmopolitanism overrides local culture. One of the problems, I think, today is that for good reasons, we're putting a lot of emphasis in our discussions right now on diversity and cultural diversity. And that's fine, so long as we don't forget that underlying all of that diversity, there is something that we have in common. Because if we don't do that, then it turns out that I cannot criticize genital mutilation of young girls because it's a different culture. So what? It's bad and it's not a good thing to do. End of story. It doesn't matter that it's a different culture.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have somebody from Zoom.
Now we're going to go to our Zoom room and see if there's any folks on Zoom that
And you get no books.
Okay, we have, thank you, Massimo. We have Teresa Forsman.
Okay.
Thank you. Massimo, thank you for your talk. I especially appreciated the very practical advice. Here's steps you can take to be virtuous. I really appreciated that. And I kind of have a practical question too. You talked about the things we can control versus the things we can't control. And I think there's a temptation among some people to see the things that we cannot control as such an overwhelming wave that we are tempted to give up on those few things we see that we can control. Right. So I have a two-part question. Do you have any sense of what that ratio is of things we can't control to things that where our agency does matter? And my second part of that question is, how do we avoid letting that wave of things we cannot control keep us from doing what we can do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm sorry that you're not here, because otherwise you would get a copy of the book.
Massimo, in my defense, I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska, so I'm thrilled to be
Next time. Next time. Or maybe the next time I'm in Nebraska. That's a very good question. So two-part question, as you were saying. So let's start with the second part first, actually. The not letting ourselves becoming overwhelmed by the number of things that we can't do. I think there a very good answer is found in Marcus Aurelius. There is book 9 of the Meditations, which I was actually just by chance looking at it just this morning before coming here, which is why I remember it's book 9, verse 26. Otherwise, I wouldn't remember. Marcus said, we're on first name basis. Marcus says, remember this was the emperor, right? So talk about somebody who has a lot of power and somebody who can actually do a lot of things, a lot more than probably all of us combined here. Nevertheless, even he had limitations, right? There were things that even an emperor couldn't do. And he says to himself in his diary, do not wait for Plato's Republic, but act in the here and now, because even a small difference is important. So this is the emperor, somebody with almost absolute power, who is reminding himself that he really should be happy with whatever difference he can make, no matter how small, because that's important. That's the way human agency works. So it's all about mindfulness in the sense of what are you paying attention to. Don't pay attention to the stuff that you cannot do anything about. Don't let yourself overwhelmed by things that you do not control. Focus your attention on doing something. Here's an example of how to do it. My friend and co-author for another book, Greg Lopez, for instance, thinks that political involvement is important, and we agree. However, unlike most people, he doesn't almost pay attention at all to national politics. I mean, it goes to vote, and he occasionally gives contributions to candidates, but that's about it. Why? Because he recognizes that his ability to influence national politics is nil. It's very close to zero. On the other hand, his ability to influence local politics is much higher, because local politicians get elected on the basis of thousands, sometimes hundreds of votes, not millions, right? That means not only that your vote is far more effective in swinging an election, but that if you start speaking out, if you actually reach out to the politician, you engage with him or her, etc., you're far more likely to get an answer, far more likely to influence that person, because that person knows that literally every single voter, especially the ones that are active, especially the ones that are actually vocal, matter. Try to do that with Schumer, forget it. Right? I tried several times. It just doesn't go anywhere, because he has to deal with millions of people, not with thousands or hundreds. So that's one example of so essentially refocusing in a way that doesn't really come natural to us. We pay a lot of attention to the national stage because we think it's more important. And in some respects it is. But in terms of agency, it's far less important than the local action. So get active at the local level. As Supreme Court Justice, I think, once said, all politics is local. Right? And that is one way to think about the fact that all politics is local. Yes, Tip O'Neill, thank you. Now, let me go back to your first question, which is, how do we determine what is and what is not under our control? You might have noticed that I didn't use, although the idea that I mentioned, what I call Epictetus's fundamental rule, is often known today as the dichotomy of control. What you control, what you don't control. I did not use the word control on purpose because I think it's misleading. Because once we start thinking about control, we start saying, well, but some things I don't control, but I can influence, and then it becomes a continuum where it's really hard to tell what exactly it is that I can influence, what is that, and what I cannot. Epictetus uses the words, what is up to you, and what is not up to you, meaning, what are you responsible for? And you're responsible, according to the Stoics at least, you're responsible for one thing and one thing only, your judgment. That's it, nothing else. Your judgment is, of course, what leads to action, right? If you judge that something is important, then you might, it might be good to do X, Z, or Y, then you're going to try to do X, Z, or Y. So your judgment is entirely up to you. Nobody else can make a judgment on your behalf. You are the one who has to make the decision to act or not to act, or whether something is good or not good, whether you want to try something or not try something. That's entirely up to you. The outcome is not up to you, meaning that the outcome of even your own actions depends always on a combination between what you do and what other people do, right? So you decide that it is a good thing to come today to listen to me at Ethical Culture in Bergen County. Great, but then your car breaks down and you can't leave home, right? So your intentions were good, and that's what was up to you. You're responsible for your intentions. You're responsible for your decisions, and say, yeah, I judge that this event is good, and I'm gonna try to make it there. Actually getting there, it's not up to you. A lot of other stuff could happen in the meantime that prevents you from being there. That's why the Stoics, and they're not the only ones, a lot of religious people do the same, they use what it's called a qualification or a reserve clause for whatever they want to do. So they say, I'll meet you tomorrow, fate permitting. Right? Or I'll get to the airport, fate permitting. Or I will help this politician being elected, fate permitting. That's an acknowledgement of the fact that a lot of stuff is not actually up to you. And therefore, that you should be focusing on what it really is up to you, which is your intentions. And only your intentions. That's the only thing that is really up to you. Now, the good news is you can work on your intentions. They're really yours. You can make decisions. On the other hand, you don't control the outcomes. Therefore, you are not also to blame for the outcome. If you try to do the right thing and it didn't work out, like I was saying earlier, when Cicero tried to save the Roman Republic and failed, it's not his fault. It's the fault of Mark Antony and Octavian and a bunch of other people, not his. He is blameless because he tried to do the right thing, and that's all you can do. Then there's nothing else on the floor.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have an ethical dilemma.
We also have another one. I'm sorry to interrupt, Terry.
Yeah.
I'm sure time is.
The ethical dilemma is we're running short on time, but I don't want to be mean to our Zoom participants. Lucy, can you answer your question?
She's had her hand up for quite a while.
Okay.
Right. Actually, my hand kept lowering itself automatically. I'm not that indecisive. I don't know why I was doing that. My question might be the same as the first one, but I wouldn't get the book because he got to you first. At the very beginning of your talk, you defined prudence as the knowledge of what is truly good or evil. Yep. It seems to me that those are subjective or absolutes. So you gave the example of eating pork. Some people think drinking is truly evil or not. Some people think that the one who dies with the most toys wins. So wealth is truly good. And then you said that the good and the evil are, the absolutes are scientifically backed up. They're backed up by modern science. And you said about modern science, that means that most people believe it to be true. But surely that's not a definition of modern science. Most people in our country might believe something that that is or isn't true. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. So let me rephrase, therefore, because it seems like I went over too quickly on a couple of things. Let me make a distinction. Modern science cannot tell you what is true or not, what is evil or not evil. That's an ethical question. It can inform that question. There certainly are facts of the matter about what makes, for instance, for a flourishing human life, right? So if we agree that whatever is good is whatever increases human flourishing, that is the human ability to not only survive, but also live a meaningful life, pursue your projects, et cetera, in a way that is in harmony and synchrony with the rest of society, then those things are factual things. So so science in the particular version of biology, psychology, and sociology can tell you something about what kinds of things are good for human beings or not. The analogy that the Greco-Romans made often was with health. You go to a doctor, and there are some things that are objectively good for human beings and some things that are objectively bad for human beings. Breaking your leg is objectively bad because you're going to be in pain, you cannot walk anymore, and things like that. So it would be really hard to say, well, that's culturally relative. There are some societies where breaking legs all the time, it's a great thing. It's like, no, that's not good, right? On the other hand, there are things that are objectively good in terms of health for human beings, right? So having a functioning heart that has a certain blood pressure, et cetera, certain levels of cholesterol and so on and so forth, that's good. Why? Because they are connected, they are causally connected to healthy, long living, right? On the other hand, there are things that your doctor will say, I don't care. There's no objective fact of the matter whether this is good for you or not, right? So you could say to the doctor, is it better to do 20 minutes of aerobic exercises by going on the elliptic machine or on the bicycle machine? Your doctor look at you and says, whatever the hell you prefer. It doesn't matter. So long as you get the 20 minutes of aerobic, the rest doesn't matter. So there are things that are objectively true and other things that don't matter in terms of both physical and mental well-being, right? Now, your point that, yes, but a lot of people nevertheless don't believe them, I agree. As I said, I was in Tennessee where a lot of people disagreed on the fact of evolution. So I'm not denying that a lot of people are going to reject facts. I am just saying that that's not my concern. Those people are just wrong about evolution. And if they want to argue, they can argue with themselves. I'm not going to waste my time arguing the point. If you reject basic science, then I don't know what to tell you. I can direct you to the next bookstore and so that you can inform yourself. But my experience is that most of those people don't want to go to bookstores anyway. So the point that I was trying to make, actually, this was in response to the first question, was that there is a distinction between the existence of an objective truth about something and whether people agree or not on that objective truth, right? For instance, I think it's objectively true that people have proved, mathematicians have proved Fermat's last theorem. But you may not believe it, because if you don't have enough knowledge of mathematics to really understand the proof of Fermat's theorem, you might say, I don't think so, I don't believe so. Well, on what basis you don't believe so? You don't understand the math. So why are you telling me that you don't believe it? But you have the prerogative to not believe it. People have the right not to believe things. But I also have the right, which we seem to question recently, to just tell them that they're wrong. I mean, we need to remember that there are some situations where it's okay to tell other people, no, I just think you're wrong. And here's the argument. Of course, whenever you say so, you have to have an argument. You have to have empirical evidence if it applies. Sometimes my students in a philosophy class use the old trope. I was like, well, but I'm entitled to my opinions. And I say, no, you're not. Not in a philosophy class. You're entitled to your opinion only if you have an argument, a good argument to defend that opinion. Otherwise, it's just garbage. And you're not going to pass the test if it's garbage. So that's one way to put it. That we shouldn't be afraid of using words such as, look, I think that's wrong. It offends people. Nobody wants to be told that they're wrong. But if you have good reasons and or good evidence, then you should stand by those reasons and evidence. Of course, always with the caveat that there is a chance that you might be the one in the wrong, right? You always have to leave that option open and say, yeah, okay, let's hear your evidence. Let's hear, like in the case of the libertarian friend, right? Let me hear your arguments. Let me hear your evidence. And then I'll think about it. Your mind should be open, but as Carl Sagan used to say, a good mind is a great thing unless it's so open that the brain falls off.
Thank you, Massimo.